I thought I was just doing my job. I had my cart, my mop, my earbuds half in with some forgettable playlist humming beneath the hiss of the ventilation system, and I was moving through the 22nd floor the way I always did on Monday mornings, methodically, quietly, invisibly. That is what they pay you for when you wear the gray uniform with the small embroidered company logo over your left breast, to be invisible, to exist in the margins of other people's important lives, to leave no trace of yourself except the smell of clean floors and fresh lemon. I had gotten remarkably good at being invisible over the past 3 years, better than I ever wanted to be, better, honestly, than I had any right to be, given that invisibility had never been something I chose. It had been chosen for me, one quiet betrayal at a time, until the life I had built became unrecognizable and the only thing left standing was me, in gray, pushing a cart through the hushed hallways of Meridian Financial Group at 7 in the morning. But the moment I stepped into Suite 2201, the moment I crossed the threshold of the corner office that had sat empty for 6 weeks and had finally been claimed on Friday by the new regional director, whose name on the frosted glass read Catherine Voss, something shifted in the air. I noticed it before I noticed anything else, a change in temperature or pressure, or some animal instinct that lives below conscious thought and knows things before the mind catches up. I stood in the doorway for just a second longer than I usually do, taking in the new furniture, the orchid on the windowsill, the monogrammed leather planner open on the mahogany desk. It was a beautiful office. Whoever Catherine Voss was, she had arranged it with the kind of precision that speaks of someone accustomed to control. And then I saw the photograph. It was a silver-framed photograph, maybe 5 by 7, positioned in the left corner of the desk beside the orchid, deliberately placed, the way you place something you want people to see. In the photograph, 3 people were standing in what looked like a hotel lobby or an upscale restaurant, somewhere warm and expensive, with the kind of ambient lighting that costs money. The woman in the center I did not recognize immediately, sharp-jawed, blonde, wearing a cream blazer, laughing with her whole face in a way that made her look like someone who had just successfully closed a deal. The person on her right, with his arm draped around her shoulder in easy, comfortable familiarity, was my husband, Mark. And the person on her left, with one hand resting on the blonde woman's shoulder in a proprietary, almost maternal gesture, was Brenda, my mother-in-law. The woman who had sat at my kitchen table 6 months before any of this and pressed a crumpled tissue to the corner of her eye, telling me in a trembling voice that she only wanted what was best for our family. My mop handle slipped from my fingers and hit the marble floor with a sound like a crack of bone. I do not know how long I stood there, long enough for the playlist in my earbud to change twice, long enough for the morning light through the floor-to-ceiling windows to shift slightly across the polished surface of the desk. I stood there staring at that photograph and felt the specific kind of cold that does not come from temperature. The cold that starts in your stomach and works outward through your blood, reaching your hands last, leaving them numb and stiff and useless. My heart was doing something wrong, too fast and then too slow at the same time, stuttering between beats in a way that felt mechanical and far away, as though it belonged to someone else. The room had a quality of having tilted slightly, the way rooms do just before you faint, and I pressed one hand flat against the wall to steady myself and focused very hard on the embossed monogram on that leather planner, KV, 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 until the world leveled out again. Catherine Voss, the new director, and Mark, and Brenda. I needed to go back 3 years to explain how I got here, because there is no way to understand what that photograph meant without understanding what came before it. What came before the gray uniform and the mop and the silence. Before the morning I walked out of my own house with 2 suitcases and a folder of paperwork and no clear idea of where the rest of my life was going to come from. 3 years ago, I was not invisible. 3 years ago, I was Clara Whitmore, and I owned 40% of a small but profitable marketing consultancy called Whitmore and Reed, which my college roommate Dana and I had built from nothing over the course of 8 years. We had started it on Dana's kitchen table, pitching local businesses out of a shared Google Drive and drinking terrible coffee late into the night. And by the time I was 34, we had 16 full-time employees and a client roster that included 2 regional banks and a national healthcare brand. I was proud of what we had made. Not the aggressive, chest-out kind of proud that people perform at networking events. The quiet, private kind that lives deep in the chest, that you feel most clearly on ordinary mornings when you unlock your office door and look at the room you built and think, I did this. No one gave it to me. I made it out of effort and years and countless small decisions, and it is real, and it is mine. I was also married, had been for 7 years, to Mark Hollis, who was handsome and steady and good at the small, consistent affections that make a marriage feel stable. Coffee left on the kitchen counter before he left for work, remembered anniversaries, an arm around my shoulder in public that said, without words, she is mine and I am glad of it. I loved him. I want to be precise about that because what came later makes it easy to flatten what we were into something simpler. Into the story of a woman who should have known better, who missed the obvious signs. But I did not miss obvious signs. There were no obvious signs, not for a very long time. What there was, instead, was Brenda. Mark's mother had been a presence in our marriage from the very beginning, the way weather is a presence, sometimes pleasant, sometimes a nuisance, always there. She was a small woman who wore cardigans in pastel colors and made excellent pies and said things that were almost criticisms, but not quite. Always just close enough to kindness that you couldn't pin them down. She had a talent for the conditional compliment. You look wonderful, Clara, considering how tired you must be. And for the question that was actually a statement, delivered with mild, curious eyes over the rim of her teacup. You're sure you two don't want to be closer to the family? A bigger house takes so much upkeep. I had learned to absorb these things the way you absorb low-level weather. I did not consider them dangerous. I did not consider Brenda dangerous. That was my first mistake, and probably my most costly one. The consultancy had a good year, then a great year. In the spring of what would turn out to be my last full year as co-owner, Dana and I received an acquisition inquiry from a larger firm based in Denver. Not a buyout exactly, but a merger that would have brought significant capital and expanded our national reach considerably. I was cautious about it. I wanted time to review, to assess, to think. Mark thought it was a brilliant idea and said so repeatedly over dinner, with the kind of enthusiasm I had never heard him apply to anything related to my work before. It's the smart move, Clara. You'd be crazy not to take it. I found his insistence puzzling, but I was so deep in due diligence that I didn't dwell on it. I told myself he was simply being supportive in his way and went back to my spreadsheets. Brenda came to Sunday dinner shortly after the offer arrived, and the conversation turned to the consultancy with a naturalness that I would only later understand had been engineered. She asked thoughtful questions. She seemed genuinely interested. At one point, she reached across the table and patted my hand and said softly, "You work so hard, sweetheart. I just want to make sure someone is looking out for you." I remember thinking it was unexpectedly kind. I remember feeling briefly something close to warmth toward her. I should have known by then that warmth from Brenda was the most dangerous thing she produced. The first thing I noticed, in the weeks that followed, was that Mark started coming home later. Not dramatically later. Not the kind of lateness that triggers alarms. But 20 minutes here, 40 minutes there. The thin margins of absence that you accumulate like loose change until one day you realize you're missing something significant. When I asked, he said work. He was distracted in the evenings, scrolling his phone with his back slightly turned, and when I moved around to see his screen, he would shift again, not quickly enough to look like he was hiding, just enough to create a closed angle. I told myself it was the pressure of the acquisition decision. I told myself I was reading too much into nothing. I was good at that. I had been trained by years of living adjacent to Brenda to doubt my own perceptions, to assume the most charitable interpretation of small wrongnesses, and I had applied that training so thoroughly to my marriage that I had essentially turned my instincts off. The second thing I noticed was that Dana started canceling our Friday check-ins. 1 week, then 2, then 3. She was vague about reasons, personal things, a family issue, nothing serious, she said. Dana and I had been friends for 15 years. I had seen her through a divorce and 2 miscarriages and the death of her mother. She did not do vague with me. The change registered somewhere in the back of my mind as a wrongness I wasn't ready to examine, and so I didn't. I sent her a text asking if she was okay. She replied with a thumbs-up emoji. I told myself that people go through phases. The third thing I noticed was Brenda's sudden, particular interest in our house. We had bought the house 4 years earlier, a 1920s craftsman in the better end of the East Side, with a porch I had refinished myself, and a kitchen I had redesigned down to the tile grout, and a garden I had spent 2 full summers making into something beautiful. It was in my name. This is an important detail. The down payment had come entirely from my savings, and when our mortgage broker had laid the documents on his desk, Mark had looked at me with an easy shrug and said, "Makes sense for it to be in your name. You're putting in the money." I had thought nothing of it at the time. The house was ours regardless of whose name was on the paper. That is what being married means, or so I believed. Brenda started mentioning the house with casual, pointed frequency. That corner lot across the street sold for $380. Property values in your area are really moving. Or, a friend of mine is looking to buy something exactly like your place. Or, one Sunday over coffee, while Mark was out of the room, leaning forward with her elbows on my kitchen table and fixing me with those mild, unreadable eyes. "Clara, have you two ever talked about, just hypothetically, what would happen to the house if things changed?" I stared at her. "What things?" She smiled her thin, curved smile and said, "Oh, I just like to think ahead. You know me." I did not know her, not even slightly. I picked up the photograph with both hands. My heart was doing that wrong thing again. Too fast, then a beat skipped, then too fast again. And the nausea gathering in my throat was hardening into something colder and more purposeful. Up close, the details of the image sharpened and multiplied. The restaurant was somewhere expensive. White tablecloths in the background, a chandelier, the amber glow of a room that charged $80 for a main course. Mark was wearing the gray blazer I had given him for his birthday the previous year. Last year. This photograph had been taken last year, while I was already here, already invisible, already wearing the uniform and pushing the cart down hallways that belonged to people like Catherine Voss. And then I saw what I had missed in the first shock of recognition. In the bottom right corner of the frame, almost obscured by the silver edge of the border, was a small printed caption. The kind that copy shops add to personalized prints. It read, "Meridian Q3 Celebration, Catherine, Mark, Brenda, October 2023, October 2023, 7 months ago." I set the photograph back on the desk with extraordinary care, the way you handle something that might still explode. I stood very still in the center of that beautiful, expensive office, in my gray uniform with my cleaning cart behind me and the morning light pouring in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and I understood, with the particular, terrible clarity that comes only at the extreme edges of shock, that I was only now standing at the beginning of understanding something I should have understood a very long time ago. The photograph was not the whole story. It was a door, standing open, onto a room I had not yet dared to enter. I reached for my phone and called the one person I knew would answer. My father picked up on the second ring. He always did. Even at 71, even 3 time zones away in the house where I grew up, he answered the phone with the same prompt certainty he had always answered everything, as if the world owed him no more warning than a single ring's worth of grace. "Clara." That was all he said. Just my name, in the low, steady voice that had talked me through every crisis of my life. And somehow the single word was enough to loosen something in my chest that had been locked down tight since the moment I saw that photograph. "Dad," I said, "I need you to listen to me." I told him about the photograph. I told him slowly, with precision, the way he had always taught me to report a problem. Facts first, feelings after. I described the caption. I described the date. I told him about Catherine Voss's name on the frosted glass, about the orchid and the leather planner, and the way the whole office had the controlled, deliberate quality of a chessboard set up for a game already in progress. My father did not interrupt. He listened the way he always listened, with the kind of still, focused attention that made you feel that every word was being weighed and stored, that nothing was being lost. When I finished, there was a silence of maybe 5 seconds, and then he said, "Don't touch anything else in that office, Clara. Do you hear me? Not one thing. Dad, go to your locker. Get your personal items. Then go to your car and wait for me to call you back. Can you do that?" I could. I did. I sat in my car in the Meridian Financial parking garage for 22 minutes. I know it was 22 minutes because I watched the clock on my dashboard with the mechanical focus of someone who needs numbers to stay grounded. The garage smelled of exhaust and cold concrete, and the fluorescent lights overhead gave everything a thin, greenish cast that made the world look slightly wrong, slightly laboratory clinical, which was appropriate, I thought, because I was performing a kind of diagnosis, running back through 3 years of memories and re-examining each one under this new, harsh light. The acquisition. Mark's enthusiasm for it, which I had read as support and nothing more. I remembered now, with the precise retroactive clarity of the newly betrayed, that it was Mark who had first mentioned the Denver firm. Not Dana, not a broker, but Mark, over dinner one night. Casual as anything. I heard Meridian's acquisition arm is looking at mid-size consultancies in this market. You should look into it. I had thought he was networking on my behalf. That was the kind of man I believed I was married to. One who networked on my behalf, who cared enough to pay attention to my industry, who was quietly, steadily in my corner. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and breathed very slowly and deliberately, the way they teach you in every anxiety workshop I had ever attended, and focused on the sound of my own exhale until it stopped shaking. My father called back in 24 minutes. "I spoke to Gerald," he said. Gerald was his college friend, a retired corporate attorney who had handled my business incorporation papers 8 years ago, and who owed my father a favor of such old and substantial vintage that he never once mentioned it. He did some checking. Catherine Voss's full name is Catherine Voss Hollis. She changed it professionally, dropped the Hollis, about 4 years ago. She is Mark's cousin, first cousin on his father's side. The concrete walls of the parking garage seemed to press inward by several degrees. "His cousin," I said, "his first cousin. They grew up together, apparently very close." My father's voice was carefully neutral in the way that means the precise opposite of neutral. "She joined Meridian 3 years ago, same month you filed for the separation." Same month. The same month I had packed my 2 suitcases and moved into a furnished studio apartment and started sending out job applications and ended up, through a temp agency, in a gray uniform on the 22nd floor. Same month Catherine Voss Hollis had walked through the door of Meridian Financial Group and begun her climb toward the corner office. Not a coincidence. Not even close to a coincidence. It was a timetable, and I had been living inside it without knowing, cleaning the floors of a plan I had never been told about. "There's more," my father said. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands. The consultancy, Whitmore and Reed. Gerald pulled the acquisition records. The merger went through, as you know. What you may not know is who brokered the deal on the acquiring side. He paused. Not for effect, my father was not a man for theatrical pauses, but because what he was about to say required a moment of its own weight. It was Brenda. She holds a business management license she obtained 15 years ago, which she has used approximately twice in her professional life. She brokered the Meridian acquisition of your consultancy and collected a commission of $68,000. $68,000. I thought of Brenda at my kitchen table, the crumpled tissue, the soft voice. I thought of her hand resting on Catherine's shoulder in that photograph, proud and possessive, the gesture of a woman who has successfully moved all her pieces into position. I thought of her mild eyes and of how long she must have been watching me, measuring me, mapping the edges of what I had built, identifying every seam where a lever could be inserted. While I handed her tea and thought of her as weather, I thought of how precisely everything had been arranged, how many months of patient, deliberate work had gone into dismantling the life I had spent a decade building, and I felt something shift in my chest, not the sick, sliding grief of the wronged. I had lived in that grief for 3 years, and I knew its texture intimately. This was something else, something cold and clear and purposeful, a click, like a lock turning from the inside. I went back into the building. I did not go to the 14th floor where my cleaning shift was scheduled. I went to the 22nd. Suite 2201 was still empty. Catherine Voss had not yet arrived for the morning. And I let myself in with the master key that all cleaning staff carry, and I stood in front of that desk, and I looked at it the way you look at something you are no longer afraid of. The leather planner was still open where I had left it. I turned it toward me and read. She kept her schedule in meticulous color-coded detail: green for internal meetings, blue for external, red for personal. Today, Monday, had a red entry at noon. Mark. Lunch. Olio. Olio was the Italian restaurant 6 blocks from Meridian's building. The same restaurant, I realized with a slow, nauseating certainty, where Dana and I had celebrated the first time Whitmore and Reed broke 7 figures in annual revenue. We had ordered a bottle of wine we could barely afford and sat there laughing about how far we had come from Dana's kitchen table, and the waiter had brought us complimentary dessert because we were so visibly, embarrassingly happy. The same restaurant. Of course, it was the same restaurant. These people had been operating inside the geography of my life for so long that their landmarks had become my landmarks without my ever knowing it. I took out my phone and photographed 3 pages of the planner. Then I photographed the photograph on the desk. Then I photographed the nameplate, Catherine Voss, Regional Director. And I walked back to the elevator and went down to the 14th floor and spent the remainder of my shift cleaning offices with a steadiness that surprised me, because my hands were not shaking anymore. My hands were very, very still. That frightened me more than the shaking had. At 11:30, I called Mark. He answered with the particular note of mild surprise he always used when I called, as though my number still caught him off guard, as though 3 years of separation and divorce proceedings had not accustomed him to the possibility of hearing from me. "Clara, is everything okay?" "I need you to meet me," I said, "in the lobby of Meridian, not at Olio. Don't cancel your lunch. Just come down to the lobby first. 15 minutes. A silence that lasted 2 beats too long. "How do you know about Olio?" 15 minutes, Mark." He came in 12. I was standing by the revolving door when he walked in from the street, and for a moment I simply looked at him. The gray blazer I had given him, the careful, slightly wary set of his face, the way he was already arranging his features into the expression I recognized from the last year of our marriage. Apologetic, deflecting, composing the explanation before the accusation had even been spoken. He looked older. He looked like someone who had made a series of decisions he was still in the process of justifying to himself, which gives a person a particular kind of tiredness. Not the clean tiredness of hard work, but the grinding tiredness of sustained dishonesty, which costs more than people expect. "How do you know about Olio?" he said again. "I'm the janitor on the 22nd floor," I said. "I cleaned Catherine's office this morning. I saw the photograph. I saw the planner." I watched him process this, watched the color leave his face in a slow, awful tide. "You knew I worked here." It was not a question. I had understood this in the car, in those 22 minutes of retroactive clarity. The temp agency that had placed me here 3 years ago, the one my friend Rebecca had supposedly recommended, I had always thought it was a lucky referral. Now I understood who had made sure the referral reached me, who had wanted me close and visible and contained. You all knew. Clara, it wasn't... Was Brenda's commission disclosed to me at any point during the acquisition process? I kept my voice very quiet. Quiet the way a wire is quiet. Not passive, not empty, but under tension. Was her relationship to the acquiring firm disclosed to Dana? Was yours? He said nothing. Was the appraisal firm that valued the house recommended by Catherine? His jaw tightened. The one that came in $120,000 below what the 3 comparable properties on our street had sold for that same year? Still nothing. Mark. I let his name sit in the air between us. I need you to say it. He looked at the floor for a long time. The lobby moved around us. Lanyards and laptops, someone rolling a presentation board toward the elevators, the ordinary business of a building that did not know or care what was happening in the space between 2 people by the door. He looked at the floor and his jaw worked, and finally he said, in a voice I barely recognized, "I'm sorry, Clara. I know that doesn't." "It doesn't," I said. "You're right." I left him standing in the lobby and walked directly to my car and drove to Gerald's office where I had an appointment my father had already arranged while I was sitting in the parking garage. The civil suit was filed 11 weeks later. Brenda's business management license, the same one she had used to collect $68,000 in undisclosed commission, was suspended pending fraud investigation within 30 days of the filing. Dana settled out of court in the 2nd month, contributing a signed affidavit detailing exactly what she had been told, by whom and when. She had been approached by Brenda directly, offered a payment to encourage me toward the merger, and had convinced herself it was in my best interest, which is the particular self-deception of people who take money to betray their friends. Catherine Voss Hollis was placed on administrative leave from Meridian Financial when the nature of her undisclosed familial relationship to Mark came to light during discovery. She resigned 3 weeks after that. The corner office on the 22nd floor sat empty again. I was still the person who cleaned it. Mark did not contest the civil findings related to the house appraisal. The court-ordered reappraisal, conducted by 3 independent firms, came in at $412,000. Combined with damages and Brenda's commission, the settlement returned to me a sum that allowed me to close the studio apartment lease, clear a significant portion of the debt I had accumulated during 3 years of survival mode living, and put a down payment on a place of my own. Modest, real, and entirely mine. I handed in my cleaning badge on a Friday afternoon in February. The woman at the facilities desk was kind about it. "We'll miss you, Clara," she said. "You always did the 22nd floor properly." I thanked her and meant it without irony, because the 22nd floor had, in a strange and brutal way, given me back the one thing that 3 people's careful, patient planning had almost permanently removed, the moment of seeing clearly. You can take a person's business and their house and their marriage and their sense of reality and reduce them to gray and invisible and alone in a parking garage. But you cannot take the moment when the picture finally comes into focus. That moment belongs only to the person who earns it. The house I bought is smaller than the Craftsman. It is a bungalow in a quieter neighborhood, with a front porch that needs repainting and a backyard that is currently nothing but dormant grass and the ghost of a garden. I have started on the porch. I am working on the backyard. On mornings when the light comes in at the right angle through the kitchen window and falls across the counter where my coffee sits, I stand for a moment in the stillness and think about what it actually means to build something. Not the idea of it, not the ambition, but the daily, unglamorous act of choosing to begin again. Some mornings, Brenda's voice surfaces in my memory, mild and curved and certain of itself. "You know me. I do now. I know exactly what you are, and I know exactly what it cost me to learn it. And I know that the learning, which once felt like only a wound, has become something else entirely. It has become the clearest, steadiest thing in me. It has become, slowly and against all reasonable expectation, the best thing about me." The orchid on Catherine Voss's desk was dead by the time the office was cleared out. I know because I was the one who cleaned it.